Great. Well, good morning. It is an absolute pleasure to be here at the Ontario Genealogical Society's DNA Day. The Toronto branch has done a fantastic job organising it, and I certainly want to thank the organisers for inviting me to speak here, especially Jean McNulty and her team, who have done a fantastic job of putting what is a fantastic programme together. I think we're going to have a fabulous day, and I'm looking forward to it. We'll also have DNA testing available, so this box on the piano stool here on the stage is full of DNA kits. So if you are interested in having your DNA tested, we do have kits available today. Now we have 60 kits altogether, and it's on a first-come, first-served basis. So just to start off with, how many people have actually done a DNA test? Okay, everybody in the room, we're not going to sell a single kit today. Well, at least it's good to know. So we'll just send them back, shall we? But if you do want to take any kits away, they're on special offer today. You can get the Family Finder test from Family Tree DNA for $89. It's usually $99. And if you want to do the Y-DNA test, it's normally $149 US. And it's going to be $129 if you want to buy it today. So if you had intended to test anybody, then you can get those kits today at a special discount. How many people are thinking of doing a DNA test? Oh, so there's still quite a few, so we might be able to get rid of a few. That'll be good. less in the luggage on the way home. Fine. Well, the other thing is, yes, I think we've talked about all of the Google and the YouTube. It's available on YouTube on that particular YouTube channel. Now, I got interested in DNA testing around about 2008. I had started helping my dad doing the family tree, and National Geographic came out with this DNA test. And I thought, oh, that looks interesting. The migration of man out of Africa 50,000 years ago. It's a little bit further back than I've managed to get in the tree currently. But it looks like a very interesting test. I'll buy one for myself. So I bought a National Genome test. And then I thought, actually, I'm absolutely appalling at Christmas presents. Why don't I give it to my dad? Because whatever DNA results he has are going to apply to me. And then I thought, how do I know he's my dad? Seriously, because how would you know? I mean, I could have been secretly adopted. How would you know if you were a secret adoption? You wouldn't, it's a secret. So I thought, wow, this is actually more risky than I thought. But I decided to throw caution to the wind, and I gave him the test, and I said, Happy Christmas, and I just was crossing my fingers behind my back as I did so. And a couple of years later, we did find out that he was a 50% match on autosomal DNA, indicating that he is at least one of my parents. Still trying to figure out which one. But, so that worked out quite well. But DNA testing does come with a government health warning. You never know what you will find. And you may find out that you were secretly adopted. You may find out that you have siblings that you never knew of. You may find out, as happened in Canada recently, that you were switched at birth at the hospital. And this Canadian chap who was Irish, raised by an Irish family, did the DNA test and found out that he was 100% Jewish. And he went back to the hospital records and he found the other baby who had been raised by a Jewish family and who thought he was 100% Jewish, but his DNA said he was 100% Irish. So it can be rather shocking, some of the revelations that DNA reveals. But today we're going to talk about genetic genealogy and the value of DNA testing. Now, this is my Irish family tree, and I guess like a lot of people here, you'll be in the same kind of situation. There's me at the bottom, my parents, my grandparents, great-grandparents, and at the level of my 3 times great-grandparents, I've identified approximately 50% of my ancestors. And then after that, the records get rather sparse, and it's very, very difficult to find any data. So this is after exploring the usual resources such as the letters in the attic, the family Bible, family lore. Then on the census side, we have the 1901 and 1911 census. Before that, we have Griffith's valuation from about 1850s, And after Griffith's valuation, there were all the cancelled books from the Land Valuation Office, and that brings us up into the 1900s. Very useful for tracing the head of the family, but doesn't tell you much about the family members. And then there's also the civil registration, birth, marriages, and death records. They started in 1865 for Catholics, 1845 for non-Catholics, and then we have church records which go back sometimes into the 1700s, but sometimes they don't start until the middle of the 1800s. So it's very much a lottery, and it's very, very difficult to find church records for a lot of parishes. And then there's collaboration online with a variety of different websites like Ancestry, MyHeritage, Genes Reunited, etc. And that has proved useful in breaking through some of my brick walls as well. And for people with double ancestry, the Glasnevin cemetery records are fabulous. They can go back to 1832, and there's 1 million people buried in Glasnevin cemetery, so that's very, very useful. And more newspapers are coming online, and they really add the flesh onto the bones of your family tree. But after all that is done, I have a massive brick wall at around about 1800, maybe 1830 for some of my ancestors, and that is probably typical of most Irish people. Anybody here who has Irish ancestry? Oh, they say 12.5% of Canadians have Irish ancestry, and you all managed to make it here today. Well done you. Yeah, anybody with Irish ancestry has a similar type of family tree. But with DNA, I have been able to break through that brick wall on one particular line of my family tree, and I've been able to go back to Limerick in the late 1600s, which is really quite unusual for an Irish family tree. And that's an indication of the value of DNA testing, and I'll be talking a little bit about that as we go along. Now, there are various companies that sell DNA kits commercially. There is Family Tree DNA, and we have some of the kits here today. They also do the lab testing for the National Geographic Project. There's also 23andMe, which includes also a medical risk assessment. So if you're interested in doing a medical risk assessment, 23andMe would be the one to do. In the UK and Ireland, we have Ireland's DNA, Britain's DNA, Scotland's DNA. They tend to be a little bit more pricey than the other ones, and they don't compare your data with anybody else's in the database, so it's just your DNA and no comparisons. And then there's Ancestry DNA, which will be launching here in Canada in the very near future. In fact, next week, is it, Leslie? Right, so those of you who've been waiting for Ancestry to launch the kit in Canada, you need wait no longer. It is finally arriving here, and that is an extra addition to the various companies that supply DNA. So what can you get from a DNA test? Well, there's a variety of different things. The first thing is a community of avid genealogists. You can also look at your deep ancestry and your recent ancestry and human migration. Let me turn that around a little bit there. You can also get your ethnic makeup, long-lost cousins, what percent Neanderthal you are. I would argue that you just have to look in the mirror first thing in the morning. Don't need DNA for that. A lot of the women are nodding their heads and looking at their husbands as they're doing that. And then you can also get your medical risk assessment. But let's look at a few of those. And the first thing, and the most important really, is a community of avid genealogists. And there you are. It's these people here in the audience. And you'll be hearing from the other speakers today who've been using DNA for a long time, just where their research has taken them, and they are sharing the fruits of that research with you. So it really is a community where we share a lot of wisdom and knowledge with each other. And the International Society of Genetic Genealogy was set up by Catherine Borge, around about 2005 or so. They have a website. They also have mailing lists on Yahoo for complete newbies, but also for people who are a little bit more seasoned. There is also the Facebook group and a variety of other DNA Facebook groups, such as the Y-DNA Project Administrators Facebook group, the FTDNA Project Admins Facebook group, and various other specialist ones. There's an autosomal DNA Facebook group, and for those who have taken the DNA course with the DNA adoption group, then there is the DNA class alumni Facebook group. So there's a huge amount of information available on Facebook. I have a very healthy skepticism about Facebook. I think it's a great way of keeping in touch with people that you don't want to speak to. But it is a very, very good way of sharing information, sharing documentation, and communicating with people about genealogy. And that's really all I use it for. I don't really use it for personal reasons at all. The other thing that ISOG have produced is the ISOG Wiki. So it's a complete Wikipedia of everything related to genetic genealogy. And you'll have this slide in the handouts that you have there with you. It's a great resource, and there's a huge amount of information there. Debbie Kennett and a variety of different people have done a huge amount of work on this. It's a great resource to have, so do check it out. Now, the other thing that this community of avid genealogists does is it produces a list of, there's a list of surnames here, and you can get a free DNA test if you have one of these surnames. Now, this is an out-of-date list, and there are probably at least 50% more surnames on this list than there were previously. But the project administrators for a lot of the surname studies are so greedy to get your DNA, they're willing to pay for the test themselves. How more avid can you get than that? So, what's involved with the DNA test? Well, many of you will know it's a simple swab. Excuse me. A simple swab or a saliva sample, and then that goes off to the lab in an envelope, and in the lab they look at your sample and they think, oh, blue, must be royal blood. And then they put that through the analyzer, and it comes out the other end onto your own personal web page. You have your kit number, you have your username, so you have your privacy assured. But not only that, they compare your results with everybody else's results in the database. And that produces a list of matches which are posted on your web page. And with Family Tree DNA, they have created an infrastructure where you can actually start your own projects. And there are more than 8,000 surname projects on Family Tree DNA, and it's a wonderful resource that the company has provided to the community. So we'll be looking at a little bit of that later on. But just to remind us of what is DNA, within the test tube, you've scraped off some cheek cells, and that's gone off to the lab. They look at these cheek cells, and within each cheek cell, you have the mitochondria, which are these little blue things down here, the batteries of the cell, and each mitochondrion has its own DNA. And there's anywhere from several hundred to several thousand mitochondria in every cell. And that compares with just a single, well, 2 copies of chromosome 1, 2 copies of chromosome 2. So there's much, much more mitochondrial DNA in the human cells than there is chromosomal DNA. That's why it's so useful for ancient DNA purposes. But that is only inherited from your mother, and she inherited it from her mother, and her mother, and her mother, all the way back along the direct female line. So it's very useful for tracing back along that path. Within the nucleus of the cell, we have the 46 chromosomes arranged into 23 chromosome pairs. 1 copy in each pair you got from your mother, 1 copy you got from your father. So you've got a paternal chromosome 1 and a maternal chromosome 1. Both chromosome 1s are exactly the same size, the same shape, the same morphology, a few little differences on them in terms of the genetic markers, but you will have 2 copies of chromosome 1, 2 copies of chromosome 2, etc., etc. You will have got half of your chromosomes from your mother, half of your chromosomes from your father. The last pair, pair number 23, also called the sex chromosomes, you either have an X or a Y, 2 X's or an X and a Y. If you have 2 X's, you're a female. If you're an X and a Y, well, you're a disappointment. Sorry. So, out of those 3 types, out of those main types of DNA, we have the 3 types of DNA test. We have the Y DNA test. Now, the Y DNA is only passed from father to son. It's never transmitted to the women. So, I would have got mine from my father, he from his father, he from his father, 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 father. Great way of going back along the direct male line. Father, father, father. And of course, what's the other thing that goes back along the direct male line? The surname. So it's very, very useful for surname studies. And that will take you back to 338,000 years ago, before the advent of anatomically modern humans, back to Africa prior to the last great exodus out of Africa 50,000 years ago. On the other side of the family tree, the exact extreme opposite is the direct female line. And the mitochondrial DNA is very useful for going back along the mother's path. And that will take you back 200,000 years ago to Africa. And together with linguistic data and archaeological evidence, DNA is a very, very useful complement to the study of human migration as modern-day humans came out of Africa and populated the entire planet, ending up at the Tierra del Fuego, the tip of South America, 10,000 years ago. Right in the middle we have the autosomal DNA, and it's called autosomal DNA rather than chromosomal DNA because it is all of the chromosomes apart from the X and the Y, that last pair, number 23. So all the first 22 pairs are called autosomal. All of the chromosomes together are called chromosomal. So that's just the reason why we have this unusual term autosomal rather than chromosomal. Think of it as all of the chromosomes apart from the last two, the sex chromosomes. And that has a much more restricted reach of only about 5 to 7 generations, which will take you back to about the level of your 4 times great-grandparents, and you have about 64 of those. So whereas Y DNA looks at only one ancestral line, mitochondrial DNA only looks at one ancestral line, autosomal DNA will look at 64 ancestral lines, approximately. So Y DNA and mitochondrial DNA, good for deep and recent ancestry, and autosomal DNA, good for recent ancestry. So let's start off by looking at the Y DNA, and this is good for deep ancestry, for surname projects, and for connecting with cousins with whom you share the same surname. This is an example of your typical chromosome. It happens to be the Y chromosome, but most of them are the same. You have the short arm at the top, the centromere, the long arm, and all along the length of it you have a variety of different genes which code for typical characteristics. And this being the Y chromosome, it's typical for the male. This gene here is the inability to see or hear the obvious. This anti-stop gene on the long arm of the Y chromosome is the refusal to ask for directions. And, oh yes, my favorite, the DC-10, the ability to identify aircraft. We all know how valuable that particular characteristic becomes in on vacation. So, that is your typical Y DNA. Also, along that the genes only actually account for about 2% of our DNA. So our DNA is only, 2% of our DNA is actually genes, where we get the term genetic from. The rest of it is, well, it used to be referred to as junk DNA, but now we know that at least 30% of our DNA purely has a regulatory function. It actually switches genes on and off. And it's largely within that unknown 98% that we have various markers on the chromosome, and those are the markers that we use for ancestry purposes and also to an extent for medical risk assessment as well. So we still have a huge amount to discover about DNA. We've only discovered perhaps about 70% of the function of the DNA in our bodies. So the remaining, there's still lots to be discovered about DNA, and it's going to continue to be a very exciting area for the next couple of decades at least. Here is a closer look at the Y chromosome, and we've unraveled it, and we have the double helix there, the famous double helix of Watson and Crick. Incidentally, Dr. James Watson's grandmother was a Gleason, so I've been avidly researching his particular Gleason line in the family for some time. Can't find the connection, but I need to get his DNA at some stage. And if you look at the 2 strands of the double helix, it has all these letters, the C, G, A, and T, and these are the nucleotide bases that are along the length of each strand. And each one is a mirror image of the other. So G always binds with C, that's curvy side with curvy side. A always binds with T, that's straight side with straight side. So you always get that kind of combination. And because of that, you only need to tell someone what is on one strand of the double helix for them to understand what is on the other strand. Now, there are 2 types of DNA marker. The first type of DNA marker is called the short tandem repeat, and repeat is the key word here, because in this example you have TAC, TAC, TAC. So the actual sequence is TAC, and it's repeated 3 times. So when you get your Y-DNA results and you see those numbers, that's the number of repeats of that particular sequence of bases. The second type of DNA marker is the single nucleotide polymorphism, and the key word here is substitution. So, for example, say this one was normally a G, but now it's been substituted with an A. Okay? So, whereas the STRs talk about repeats of bases, and there's many of them, the single nucleotide polymorphism refers to only one single base, one single letter. So those are the 2 types, and we'll be talking about both of those during the course of the presentation. The first type, the YSTR markers, this is what it looks like when you get your results. And really, when you get this list of numbers, it doesn't tell you very much. You have the markers up here, there's the names of the various markers, and here are the values for each of those markers. So this one here, for example, has 12 repeats at marker number 426. It doesn't tell you a huge amount. It will tell you roughly what haplogroup you belong to. And a haplogroup is just really a group of people who are grouped together because they have broadly the same genetic signature. It's more or less the same. And my particular one is ORM269, which is the most common in Western Europe. It probably tells you that it's likely that your ancestors came from Western Europe in the last couple of hundred years, maybe a couple of thousand years. We do have to be a little bit careful, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in due course. But apart from that, it doesn't really tell you a huge amount. So it's only when you start comparing your results with other people's results that's when the real value of DNA testing comes out. And this is one of my cousins in the Spearin surname project, and you can see that they have a variety of different matches. You have the genetic distance over here on the left-hand side, how far away from an exact match they are. So an exact match would be 0, because there's no difference between the 2 people being compared. A difference of 1 out of 37 indicates that one of the values is different, and usually it's stepwise. So maybe instead of 12, it's 13. So that's the genetic distance. Here are the various names, and you can see Spearin, Spearin, Spearan, Spearin, 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 Krill, Spearin, Spearin, Mulligan, Sisela, Manning, Mackenzie. Most of the names are Spearin, and that would indicate that these people are genetic cousins within the last 300 to 400 years. They share a common ancestor within the last 300 to 400 years. But the ones that don't have the same name, Spearin, there's 3 possibilities. Either it is a non-paternity event, and by non-paternity event, it doesn't mean, as I originally thought, that there was no father involved. Seriously, the first thing I thought of was the Immaculate Conception. It doesn't mean that. Another way of expressing it is not the parent expected. And there are a variety of reasons for why that might be. Illegitimacy is the most obvious one, the one that everybody thinks of. But secret adoption is another one. Another option would be a young widow gets remarried to a second husband, maybe 6 or 12 months after her first husband has died. She's got a 6-month-old child, she's got a 1-year-old child. They take on the name of the second husband. So that frequently happens, and that's a reason for the uncoupling of the Y-DNA and the surname. A legal name change is also a very common reason. Certainly in my Spearin study, the Spearins were intermarried with the Penningtons, so I went up to Pennington Hall in Muncaster, in the Lake District in England, to see if I could track any of the Penningtons down and see if they had any information about my Spearins. And as I arrived, there was an old gentleman pruning the roses, and I said, on the off chance, I said, "You're not one of the Penningtons by any chance?" He said, "Oh, what do you want to know?" And I said, "Oh, we're probably related generations ago, back in the 1400s, and I've been doing DNA testing, etc." And he said, "Oh, there's no point in taking my DNA. I had to change my name to marry the missus. She's the Pennington." And I said, "Oh, right, okay, well, is her father still alive?" "Oh, yes, yes, there's no point in taking his DNA. He had to change his name to marry the missus." So there's 2 generations of Penningtons that weren't Penningtons. So I went back down to London at that stage. Yes, there's a variety of different reasons for why you might have a non-paternity event, and a legal name change, either for marriage or for inheritance, is a common reason as well as you go back in time. But to show you the value of Y-DNA testing in a surname project, I'll talk to you a little bit about the Spearin surname project. And this is one of mine. My great-great-great-grandfather was a Patrick Spearin from Limerick. And using, there's this fantastic story some years ago that I contacted Bob Spearin by email, and I saw on the line that he was interested in the Spearin surname. So I said, oh, do you know where the Spearin surname came from? Yours sincerely, Morris. One line email. I got 4 pages in response, a thesis. And he told this fantastic story of how a group of the Spearin researchers in the US had found these wills in Ireland from Matthew and Luke going back to the 1720s, and they've been able to construct this 5-generation family tree based on these 2 wills. And apparently the Spearins had married into the Hartwell family. And the Hartwells were mayors of Limerick back in 1676, and they were granted land by Charles I for their services to him against Oliver Cromwell. And there's a scrap of evidence that these Spearins, who named their children Hartwell Spearin, George Hartwell Spearin, Charles Hartwell Spearin, a scrap of evidence that links them back to London in the 1500s, where they were goldsmiths. And these goldsmiths lived on Leadenhall Street under St Andrew's Undershaft, which is now where the Gherkin stands today, and there's a potential link to Cambridge. And in Cambridge, Henry VIII gave Nicholas Spearin a license to print books, and he became one of the first printers of the Cambridge University Press. And they were from a very large family of people involved in the book trade in Flanders, where everybody was called Nicholas Spearin. And this chap was best friends with Erasmus, the greatest philosopher that Europe has ever produced. So I told this story to my dad, and he said, well, I'm related to them, but you're definitely not. You can't even read a book. So that's when we turned to DNA. And out of this group of us, several took the test. And these were people from with different variants of the spelling of the surname, but they all went back to Limerick. And it turned out that the first few people in the project were exactly the same. So here you have the markers along the Y chromosome, and the values for each of these markers here. Imagine just the Y chromosome of these various members being stacked on top of each other. And you can see that there's no mutations at all until you get down to the very end. This one here, CDYB, is 40, when it's 41 with these 2 people here, and 42 with this person here, indicating an exact or very close match for everybody in the group. And that was where we got our first lesson. Number 1, you are all genetically related to each other. I was shocked, because the implication is that you share a common ancestor sometime in the last several hundred years. Lesson 2 was beware of surname spelling. You know, just because somebody has a different variant of the surname doesn't mean they're not related to you. And I'm sure a lot of you have found this in your own research, that you find that somebody is related to you that has a very unusual variant of your particular surname. The third important lesson was you're on the right track. Keep going with your research. Because without DNA, I would have said to Bob, thank you very much for your 4-page reply. I will take great pleasure in reading it at some point in the future. Best of luck with your research. And I would have left it at that, because I would have thought that's an interesting story, but it doesn't apply to me, because there's nothing in that story that I recognize from my own research. But the DNA said, hold your horses, think again. You are related to these people. This is part of your story too. So DNA actually helps us to go on to the next step in our research, and certainly that is one of one of the great values of DNA testing, that it actually helps you in this regard. We tested a lot more Spearins, and they all came back as either exact or very close matches to each other, and now there's 12 people in the group. I had a family reunion a week ago in Toronto with 8th and 9th cousins that I've never met before, and I've only been communicating with them on Facebook. So that's the value. It actually brings people together that you never would have thought. And most of them were Ontario, but one of them was from Newfoundland and one of them was from Australia. So it really brings families together from all over the world. And then I also had a reunion up in Barrie, in the Simcoe County Museum, where the Spearin log cabin, which was built in 1834, was donated by Dr. Curtis Spearin in 1963. And Dr. Curtis Spearin, aged 92, was there for the reunion as well. So we had a fantastic time. And these are the most distant known ancestors of all of my 8th and 9th cousins. And they all go back to Limerick. So lesson 4 tells us that anybody called Spearin or Spearing who can trace their ancestry back to Limerick is probably genetically related to us. And if they did the DNA test, they would come out as positive as well. So it's changed the way that I think about my particular surname on that line. Now, my Spearin is right in the middle of my family tree, and my Y DNA, of course, is Gleason. Gleason, 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 Gleason. But what I did was I went back to my great-great-great-grandfather and I traced all his descendants and I found a direct male line of descent and I got that person's Y DNA, and that was my 3rd cousin Brian. It turned out that he was a work colleague of my best friend on the road where I grew up. So my best friend Connor said, "Would you like me to introduce you to your 3rd cousin?" I said, "Yes, please, very much, and you hold him down and I'll swab his cheeks." So that worked out very well. And Brian was fascinated because I was able to give him a lot of information about the family that he never knew. So it was a way of engaging him, hooking him in, and then saying, "DNA, please." "Yeah, sure, and I'll even pay for it myself." How often would we like to hear that phrase? But the important point here is that when we think of our Y DNA, we only think of our Y DNA as individuals. But realistically, you can research any surname in your family tree if you find the right male cousin to take the test. And that's the take-home message there. Here's a graphical presentation of the direct male lines of all of the Spearins in the Spearin Surname Project in Genetic Family 1. Here's the Ontario 1 family, 3 people have tested. New Jersey 1 person has tested. Limerick 10, Australia 1 person. Dublin 1 person has tested. That's my cousin Brian. There's me there. I'm just putting myself in just to show you that there's a female break in the direct transmission of Y DNA, and therefore I'm not a suitable candidate, so I had to go to my male cousin to get the proper Y DNA. Here's Ontario 2, Ontario 3, 2 people have tested, Philadelphia 23 and Georgia 1. They've all tested, and what we can conclude so far is that, first of all, going back to the Hartwell forename, from these wills back in the 1720s, there's a Hartwell here, they married into the Hartwell family. There's a Hartwell here in present-day family trees, a Hartwell here, a Hartwell here. These people, because Hartwell as a forename is as rare as hen's teeth, for example, there were 15,000 Nicholases per million newborns in 1995. In the US, there were 5,000 Lukes per million newborns in the US in 1999. The forename Hartwell, they stopped recording it in 1967 because there have been fewer than 4 instances of Hartwell as a Christian name per million newborns since 1967. So the combination of an extremely rare Christian name with a relatively rare surname guarantees with 99% probability, and there is still that 1% of doubt, there always will be, 99% probability that we can trace ourselves back to these early Limerick Spearins. But because everybody is genetically related to each other, these yellow people down here who have tested, it means that all of these families can piggyback on the longest genealogy and can jump back across that silent divide of the 1700s to the early 1700s, the late 1600s in Limerick. I've been able to do it because I'm genetically related to the Hartwell Spearins that can jump back from their family using documentary evidence to these early Limerick Spearins, because they have this unusual surname combination. Now, it may not be the unusual surname combination that allows you to jump back. It might be that somebody has the family Bible, and they have documentary evidence that goes all the way back. It may be that one of the lines was gentry. And in actual fact, all of us 8th and 9th cousins in the Spearin family have an 8th cousin, 9th cousin in Sir Anthony Hartwell, who is the 6th Baronet of Dale Hall in Essex. And I wrote to him just before I came here, and I'm hoping that when I get back home, in response to my request to put me in touch with the family historian, I'll have a letter waiting for me from Sir Anthony, my esteemed cousin, who will tell me everything I need to know about the Hartwell side of the family. And by, hopefully, there will be some information there on the Spearins as well. So that is just the value of DNA testing. It allows you to piggyback onto the longest genealogy in the group. And that really is a great boost to your own family tree research. There are still some further questions. We have 3 to 4 missing generations there, and those will need to be found at some point in time. But the records are so sparse that what we find is that we're left with what we call orphan records. We're going to have to do a mapping exercise where we collect every single record for every single Spearin. We allocate each record to a specific family that we know it belongs to, and then we're left with records that we cannot allocate. And those records then we will have to try and see if we can find which family is it most likely to belong to, and then look for additional documentary records to see if we can actually link those up properly. The Earl of Dunraven estate papers are in 22 boxes in the University of Limerick Library. There are 1,000 documents in each box, and somewhere in those sheaf of documents perhaps lies the answer to these missing 3 to 4 generations. So as soon as I heard this piece of information, I thought that these boxes had retirement plan written all over them. Can we link back to these London Spearings who are goldsmiths? That's still a question. I have looked for direct male line descendants of these London goldsmiths, but unfortunately I cannot find any, and Lord Pennington in Pennington Hall wasn't a great help, but his roses look fantastic. And then can we link back to these Cambridge Spearings and this first printer of the Cambridge University Press who was best friends with Erasmus? We looked for direct male line descendants there. We haven't found any yet. Can we link back to Flanders, where this family were involved in the book trade? We haven't been able to do so as yet. We are testing more and more people from England, because they might be English Spearings. We are testing more and more Spearings from Holland and Belgium and Germany, but again, there hasn't been any evidence at this point of a match that allows us to say we originally came from Somerset, or we originally came from Flanders. But that is the current state of the project. Once we do get that match, that will add great value to our research. Now, that's all based on STR data. Now, SNP data is the other type of marker, and we started off with very few SNPs, say 5 or 6 years ago when SNPs were first used. But now, with the advent of the big Y, it really opened the gates to finding the finer branches of the human evolutionary Y DNA tree. So, for example, in 2002, on the haplogroup R1b, there were only 16 branches. And then it went up to 24, and then 71, and then 250. And now we probably have something close to 1,000 branches in haplogroup R1b alone. And perhaps maybe in 3 years' time, in 2018, we will have branches for each individual family on the planet. The only problem is we need to test each individual family on the planet. So it is going to take a while to actually get this information together, but technically it is feasible and possible. So in the next 5 years, SNP marker testing will map out the finer branches of the genetic tree of humanity, and that will tell us a lot about the origins of our surname. This is an example of the haplogroup R1b, which is the most common in Europe, around about 80%, and you can see that it's heavily concentrated in Western Europe. The other common one is haplogroup I1, which is most concentrated in Scandinavia, but also in Northern Europe and also in England. And then in Africa, we've got haplogroup A2, A3, and E1B1A is a very, very a prominent one associated with the Bantu migration. So the SNP testing can give you a very, very broad idea of where your ancestors may have come from in the distant past. Now, of course, all of this is based on people who have tested today. And we have to be very careful about extrapolating from the data, from the population distribution data based on a present-day population. We have to be very careful about extrapolating back in time, because today's population distribution may not reflect the population distribution 10,000 years ago. And in actual fact, in Europe, 10,000 years ago, R1b was not a very common haplogroup. It was haplogroup G that was very prominent in Europe about 10,000 years ago. But for some reason, that has now been superseded by haplogroup R. So they're looking at ancient DNA from bodies that they've dug up that died 5,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago, and the majority are haplogroup G rather than haplogroup R. So the big question is, what actually happened that caused haplogroup R to become so prominent in Europe? And we do have to remember that over the course of time, our ancestors were subjected to the most incredible environmental stresses. What happened in, was it 1348? Exactly, the Black Death spread across Europe. And what percentage of the European population did it kill? 50%? Yeah. I've seen 50% personally. You know, to have half of the population die, you know, that is incredible, absolutely incredible. Spanish flu, 1918. 50 million people around the world died. To what extent were we genetically selected as the survivors? So these are fascinating questions that DNA is really helping to throw some light on. It's also reached the stage that we're getting down to the nitty-gritty, the finer branches of the evolutionary tree, that some particular SNPs are becoming very localized. So for example, this is a picture of Z253, and it's very, very localized to Southern Ireland. And in a couple of years' time, what we will find is that these SNPs, as more and more people test, are associated with specific surnames. And what we're finding in Ireland is that these surnames are actually correlating quite nicely with a lot of the surnames we find in the ancient annals. So in due course, you'll be able to take a DNA test and it'll connect you with a genealogy that goes back to 900 AD, because Ireland has the oldest genealogies in Europe. So a lot of the names that are mentioned in association, for example, with Brian Boru, they're finding now that people who share a similar SNP marker can, those surnames correlate also with the ancient Irish annals. So that's going to be a very, very exciting time in a few years. But everybody that does this Y-DNA test, they should join a haplogroup project because it helps define the smaller branches and gives you advice on what SNP markers to test. It may eventually be associated with specific clans, tribes, and ethnic groups. There's a variety of different R1b projects available. Anyone who has done a Y-DNA test, do join your appropriate haplogroup project. And there's various geographical projects as well. So, for example, if your Y-DNA is of Irish descent, then you could consider joining the Ireland Y-DNA project. The Munster Irish project is a great project, very well run by the admins. Ulster Heritage as well is another geographic project for Ireland. In England, we've got, in the United Kingdom, we've got Cornwall, Devon, Northumberland, Essex, Wessex, Anglo-Saxon, Bristol Channel, Isle of Man. So there's a whole range of geographic projects. And in America there's many, and in Canada there's many as well. Heritage projects are fairly new, and a great example of the Heritage Project is the Scottish Prisoners Project. And this is run by John Cleary. And the story here is that when Cromwell defeated the Scots at the Battle of Dunbar, he marched 5,000 soldiers, several hundred miles, down to Durham Cathedral.
2,000 of these soldiers died along the way, and when they reached Durham Cathedral, the death from fever and famine continued, and another 1,000 died. So in the end, he ordered that 1,000 prisoners be sent to the West Indies, which at that stage included Virginia, Maryland, and possibly Connecticut as well, so that they would be sold into indentured servitude. And we have records that about 150 of them arrived in 1650, and there was an additional 300 shipped out there in 1651. Apologies for the change in sound quality, but there was something wrong with the original video, so I've had to re-record the last 15 minutes of this presentation. So, is a Y-DNA test the best test for you? Well, it'll help you determine your deep ancestry, the path of human migration out of Africa, and what haplogroup you belong to. It may eventually link up to the ancient annals, and it's useful for confirming a relationship between two men on their direct male lines. Now, there are over 8,000 surname projects on family tree DNA, which is a great resource. A variety of different geographic projects will help you elucidate the relationship of your surnames to others in the same geographic area, and haplogroup projects are particularly useful at looking at deep ancestry and informing you on what SNP marker to test next. And the project administrators of these haplogroup projects are a source of great support. And finally, heritage projects like the one that we've just mentioned about the Scottish prisoners will prove to be of very intense historical interest in times to come. And like I say, the project admins are a great source of support. So that's Y-DNA. Now the next type of DNA test is the mitochondrial DNA, useful for deep and recent ancestry, and this has a reach of approximately 200,000 years, going back all the way to Africa before the last major exodus of humanity out of Africa 50,000 years ago. And this is done via mitochondrial DNA, and mitochondrial DNA are passed on from mother to children, but only the daughters of the children pass it on to their children. So in this way, mitochondrial DNA stops wherever there is a male child, but continues to be passed down wherever there is a female child. So it's very, very useful for tracking the mother's line. And to illustrate the application of mitochondrial DNA in genealogy, I want to talk to you about the king in the car park, otherwise known as Richard III, the Hunchback King. And there's been a lot of talk about him recently in the media because, of course, he was recently reburied in Leicester Cathedral. Now, Richard III is a much maligned historical figure. You'll all be familiar with the Shakespeare play Now as the Winter Raw Discontent Made Glorious Summer by this our son of York. And that's the Hunchback King. There's a plaque to him in Leicester Cathedral, or at least there was until his recent reburial, but the Richard III Society, led by Philippa Langley, have long campaigned to have his reputation revealed and for its true worth. And they did some research of their own and discovered that people had been looking for the body of Richard III in the wrong place. He was reported to have been buried in Greyfriars Abbey, but in actual fact people had been looking in Blackfriars Abbey. So they looked at ancient maps and found that it lay on the present place of the Social Services Department car park in Leicester, and so they raised the money and they dug it up. And almost immediately they found a skeleton just right in the nave of the church where you'd expect to find royal burials. There were war wounds on the skeleton, such as a spike through the skull and a humiliation wound on the pelvis. Analysis of the bones revealed that he had a high mineral diet, which is something that would only be found in royal people. And they found a living descendant, Michael Ibsen, and you see him here being swabbed by Tory King. And they did facial reconstruction of the skeleton, and it did look somewhat similar to what the portraits of Richard looked like. Now, here is Richard's pedigree, and it's a very useful way of illustrating the direct female line of descent. Now, Richard had mitochondrial DNA, which he got from his mother, but of course, being a male, he would not have passed it on to any of his descendants. However, his sister, who also got mitochondrial DNA from his mother, would have passed it on to her daughter, and then her daughter, Anne, and then Catherine, and then Barbara, and then Margaret, and then Barbara, and then Barbara, 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 Anne, Charlotte, Muriel, and Joy Ibsen, and finally her son, Michael Ibsen, who would have been the end of the line because, of course, being male, he would not have passed on that mitochondrial DNA. So this is an example of the unbroken transmission of mitochondrial DNA along the direct female line from Richard III's mother to Michael Ibsen, his living descendant alive today. And it's really emphasizes the fact that it is a direct female line along which this mitochondrial DNA passes. Now, this was only one piece of evidence, and it was the totality of the evidence altogether that suggested that the remains they found in the car park of the Social Services Department in Leicester were in fact those of Richard III, so much so that they have now reburied him in Leicester Cathedral. And there has been a very recent paper that came out describing the statistical analysis, and I believe the probability is somewhere along the lines of 99.997%. So very, very probable indeed. So is a mitochondrial DNA test the best test for you? Well, it will give you your deep ancestry. It will tell you what haplogroup you belong to, similar to the Y DNA. And it's useful for confirming a relationship between two people on their direct female lines. And again, the project admins are a source of advice and support. So certainly do consider that. Now finally, I'd like to turn to autosomal DNA. Now, we've looked previously at Y DNA and mitochondrial DNA, and it's important to remember that we have many, many ancestral lines, and that the Y DNA and mitochondrial DNA just measure the lines at the extreme of our family tree. So here's a good example of how misleading that can be. Here's Professor Henry Louis Gates, the famous presenter of Finding Your Roots, and also he has an excellent website called The Root, which is available there on those hyperlinks. And he did his Y DNA testing, and it went back to Niall of the Nine Hostages, haplogroup RM222, who is a warlord from Ireland who lived somewhere between 500 and 900 AD. And this, of course, is a vestige of the slave trade. And about 35% of African American men will actually have a Y DNA haplogroup that goes back to a European man rather than an African man. Now, Professor Gates then turned to his direct female line, his mitochondrial DNA, and he had that tested, and that came back as European as well. And that occurs in about 10% of African Americans. And some of this may be a vestige of the slave trade. In Professor Gates's case himself, he went to see Professor Dan Bradley at Trinity College Dublin, and they came to the conclusion that it was most likely that one of his distant ancestors was an Irish indentured servant. So this goes to illustrate how you can be misled into thinking that your ancestry is of a certain nature if you're just going to measure Y DNA and mitochondrial DNA. Because these only measure the extremities of your family tree. To look at all of your ancestral lines, the autosomal DNA is the test to do. And this will tell you about your ethnic makeup. It will connect you with genetic cousins. It also can tell you about medical risk factors and what percentage Neanderthal you are, but we're not talking about that today. Whether you test with 23andMe, Ancestry, Family Tree DNA, you should always upload your results for free to GEDmatch, because this will allow you to fish in 3 pools instead of 1. One of the first things you get from autosomal DNA is your ethnic makeup, and this is the ethnic makeup of an average African American man. The sub-Saharan African component would be anywhere between 65 and 80%, the European component would be anywhere between 19 and 29%, and the Native American component is usually along the lines of 0.6 to 2%. So This will be of more relevance if you come from a background that has a mix of different ethnic groups, but in due course, with projects like the People of the British Isles project and the Irish DNA Atlas project, we will be able to get sub-regional variations in our ethnic mix. So in a few years' time, we might be able to say 10% of your DNA comes from Cornwall, 20% from North Wales, and 50% from the North Orkney Islands. So that is hopefully something that will happen within the next 5 to 10 years or so. And it will give us a much more granular breakdown of our ethnic makeup. Now, I have tested myself, and that allows me to have a reach of about 5 to 7 generations, roughly back to my 4 times great-grandparents. But I've also tested my father and my mother's sister, so I've gone back an extra generation in my family tree because of that. And it's always worthwhile testing the older generations. Now, I'd like to tell you about the mystery of the wedding memento to illustrate how autosomal DNA has helped in my own particular situation. And this is the wedding memento in question. David Patterson marrying Ruby Kathleen Gleason, married at Thargomindah, the 23rd of March 1893. Now, I asked my father, who was this person? He said, I don't know, I don't think it's one of ours. So I did a search and I found that Thargomindah was right in the middle of the Australian desert. So the immediate question was, what was the wedding memento of this Ruby Kathleen Gleason doing among my dad's grandfather's papers, and why was she getting married in the middle of the Australian desert, and why did her wedding memento end up halfway around the world in Dublin? Well, I sent off to Australia for her marriage certificate, and it said that her parents were John and Anne Gleason. And I thought, oh, fantastic, because my great-great-grandparents were also John and Anne Gleason. But could I be certain that they were the same ones? No, not at all. She was born in Longstone, so was my great-grandfather Martin and his siblings. Her father was a hotel keeper, but mine was a labourer. She was born about 1872, which corresponded roughly with the births of my great-grandfather and his siblings. She went to Australia in 1886, which would have been a year after my John Gleason died. We had family lore that Timothy and Winifred went to Australia, and Winifred had a daughter who was a concert pianist or a singer. Well, I put the tree up on Genes Reunited, and 2 years later I managed to find Ruby Kathleen's grandson, Alan, and he was in his 80s, and we struck up an email relationship. He was able to give me some additional information about Ruby, that she had an uncle and aunt who lived in Sydney, her brother was a famous baseball player, went off to the US, and she had a daughter, Alma, who was a musician and excelled at the violin. So there were tantalizing parallels between the two families, but I couldn't be absolutely sure that her John and Anne Gleason were the same as mine. So we turned to DNA. Now, if Dad and Alan were indeed second cousins, as the documentary evidence seemed to be suggesting, then we'd expect them to have 3% shared of DNA. In fact, they had 2.6. I had 1.5. Everything pointed to the likelihood that Ruby and Ruby and Martin were in fact siblings. So the DNA was very useful in this situation as it confirmed a suspected relationship, and that really goes to show how autosomal DNA can answer specific questions and confirm that two people are related. But most people who do autosomal DNA testing do a fishing trip, and these are the kind of results. And the secret to success is to have an online tree, to collaborate in small groups, and to use DNA as a pointer. It tells you where to look. It says A and B are related, now go away and find out how you are connected. So, is autosomal DNA test the best test for you? Well, it'll tell you about your ethnic makeup, what percent Neanderthal you are, the medical risk you have if you test with 23andMe. Useful for confirming a suspected relationship between two people, but it works best with close cousins, and up to third cousins is the best. There are limitations to DNA testing. It's not a substitute for documentary research. Cost is still a factor, even though it's coming down in recent years, and understanding the results can be a problem because oftentimes people find them too technical. Privacy, data protection, and legal implications will always be hot topics for the debate, and you may be in for a surprise. You might find that you're secretly adopted, that there's an illegitimacy in your family, so it is always useful to bear that in mind should you decide to take a DNA test. So most of the matches that you find will actually be depends on where you're based. Family Tree DNA's database is 70% US, 23andMe's is 90% US, and Ancestry DNA's is around about 99% US, although these percentages will change with the recent introduction to 23andMe and Ancestry outside of the US. So that really concludes everything I need to say to you about DNA and genealogy, and I hope you found this presentation of interest. Thank you.